Hey, this is John from Damn Best Racing Carburetor. I've had a few questions about trying to do something on the hood scoop and fuel distribution under the carbs. So I've done my traditional draw a little stick figure to try to explain this, because trying to do it on a running engine would be very difficult in some regards. So that's why I'm going to do it this way. If there's any extra explanation that needs to be done, send me forward an email, and I certainly will, or through Facebook, and I'll certainly try to add it to it. Because many people ask me when I'm tuning, and this is what led to this little video, how the hood scoop adds to the separation on the O2's when you read it in the race pack or some other data acquisition. So first off, I want to change how I relate to, or explain to you how I relate to what is called the O2 meter. For those that work close to me, I've changed the definition of the meter to combustion meter, because it's really giving you a sense of the combustion. The leaner it shows relative to number means that the combustion is more complete. So I don't rely on it to separate and tune the engine by itself. It's just an indication of how good the combustion is. There may be other influences such as thermodynamic or improved insular motion, and it can be in one cylinder based on the manifold layout, that makes the combustion meter show a better performing cylinder by it having a higher numerical ratio between the air and the fuel. So I'm trying to be technically correct there, because I don't look at these things as the mass do. I just don't. I've been in the beginning when these meters were developed, and like I said before, I would not have labeled it an air-fuel ratio meter. I would have, at that point, labeled it combustion meter, but they needed something to relate to in the car, so somebody labeled it that, but doesn't mean I have to, excuse me, relate to it when I'm analyzing the information solely based on it being an air-fuel ratio meter. So with that said, what I drew in front of this is a hood scoop. These are only the venturis to the carburetor I've labeled to the right, and this is the plenum, which is what I labeled here, and this would be like a big block Chevrolet where the valve arrangement is symmetrical, but the plenum arrangement and runner arrangement is not symmetrical. And this is a pretty common valve and manifold layout for a lot of the race engines that use big block Chevrolet. There may be some movement to this, but this is a pretty representative standard drawing. So the way that fuel is distributed down through the engine can really matter. In the earlier carburetors, where the droplets were bigger, I'm just going to put one little booster in here. When you have really big droplets coming out of the carburetor, they would tend to fall straight down. And if you remember how lean these front cylinder is, there's no law that the fuel from this venturi must go into this to this runner assembly over here on the far right. It's drawn in by vacuum, but if the droplets are big and they fall straight down, there's no rule that says it has to go in there. So a lot of people know you could put some pretty incredibly big jets in the, especially in the number 2 cylinder, or the number 1 cylinder in some cases, and it still would be fairly lean, even though the droplets would be big as heck. If you go into the Damn Best 1 in YouTube, you can actually see wet flow pictures, and we did in some of the carburetors when we were first doing them, before the boosters change at the airflow rate that would be consumed, and they're just huge. We actually call them globules. They were just so large, and there's no ability for expectation for that to go in plenum and do anything more than fall straight down and not manage to get over into the edge of the plenum and find its way down into the intake ball. So if you're looking at this much movement for that. So as the engine speed goes up in the earlier carburetors, the droplets get somewhat smaller and giving it some ability to stay in the airstream. But some of it's a real joke when you're looking at what you're expecting from the carburetor. Another cylinder in the mid cylinders over like 5 and 6. A lot of times if you're looking at how much effort has to go in there, people say, why is 5 and 6 tend to be a problem? Well, if you look at the layout and how much it's got to do, it's about the same as it going into 1 and 2 in the front. There's typically a lot of effort it has to go in to fill in the front of the plenum. The damn best carburetors as they've been evolving, first off, the Venturi being above the booster puts a lot more signal on the booster, making the droplets more small. And people says, just putting on the carburetors just flatten them out a bunch, which is true, because now the smaller droplets can fill in the space in the plenum a lot more easily than the large droplets. But as we get down and we begin to have a hood scoop pressure, air going in here, and the inertia of the air going in, once again, the air going in the carburetor, in the hood scoop, tends to want to go towards the back of the hood scoop. And doesn't mean it has to go in here. You have to feel the pressure completely inside the hood scoop before it'll even recognize it. So the airspeed tends to want to make the air itself flow towards the back. If you're going enough speed, what will happen is the air will go down in the back, and this is where you get some of this stuff when you get some really odd air-fuel ratios, and all of a sudden they start running flat. It'll go down in here. Yes, the engine's consuming through the plenum, but it still has the ability to draw air into the back and then circulate through the plenum as you get some really high-speed cars. So the air will go in and actually circulate within the circuit. Some of it goes down, but some of it circulates, so it'll actually draw air back up and then circulate through the system in this case, counterclockwise fashion. If we happen to be on the other side of the engine, it would be clockwise. So I want to explain what the optimum shape and way to look at your hood scoop and the plenum. So you got an opening to the hood scoop and even the plenum above the carburetors. And some of it's hard just to explain because it takes years of experience. The hood scoop, when you have the carburetors drawing on the area, you can actually draw a vacuum inside the hood scoop. For instance, if the opening is too small. We'll say if the opening was covered and only had a couple of square inches of an opening here, then you could actually draw a vacuum inside the hood scoop when you're raising the engine's RPMs up. For instance, if you leave the hood scoop plug in, I don't know if anybody's ever done that. I have done that and forgot to take the hood scoop plug out at one point. Well, then you can draw a vacuum inside there because there's no air going in the front of the hood scoop, even at lower RPMs. So you have the total volume versus the air supply. Then you have at which point in the hood scoop do you develop pressure in the hood scoop? And then how much volume is around the carburetor so that when you're not filling the hood scoop with forward motion air pressure, the air pressure coming in the front of the hood scoop has not gotten greater than the vacuum draw, so you're not building pressure. It's neutral. So you have the volume around the carburetors, you have the amount that gets filled, and then you have the direction of the air in the hood scoop. So what I found, and I used it as a rule of thumb, because I built hood scoops that had no volume and only opening. They had some back, I forget who made it, it's been a while now, where it was a really nice hood scoop, and I cut it off and I put it on the engine, and it had no volume around the hood scoops. So basically, you're trying to fill it only through the front, and there was no volume in it. and what I found is a pretty good rule, is about 130 miles an hour. Everything under 130 miles an hour was suffered because there was no volume around the carburetors to draw the air from, because you're looking at this point drawing air into the carburetors. So it needed volume around the carburetor, so it didn't try to draw from one side of the carburetor and keep the flow. So at 130 miles an hour, where in the racetrack do you reach 130 miles an hour? Well, that has to do with the fill rate. So I would separate the opening from the volume at where the car, or the, in this case, we're talking cars or motorcycles, get to 130 miles an hour. And that can change based on the opening. The bigger the opening, the sooner it would be. The smaller the opening, the later. So what you have to look at in reference to the opening size, it's simple. You take the square inches of the opening, and you figure based on how fast you're going, how many feet per second. And you get feet per second, so you got a foot. And how many, then you got square inches, so you got to take that, to get cubic feet, so how fast the fill rate is on your hood scoop. You'll see a lot of Formula cars can run very, very small hood scoop openings because they're looking at fill rate. They know the car is going to be running 140, 150 miles an hour, 200 miles an hour, so they're looking at fill rate. Because if they get more opening, they'll either get too much pressure, I'll get to that in a second, or it begins to be drag on the vehicle, like a parachute. You got all this opening, and the engine doesn't need it for fill rate, so you change a bunch of stuff. So in a hood scoop, you can actually get them on there and really begin to create problems. You get a big opening, and and it has the ability at 200 miles an hour to have 4 or 5 times the fill rate of the engine. Oh my goodness! You think that what I was just mentioning before, circulating in here. But if it creates a significant pressure, now you go back into your all the time you spent on developing camshafts and overlap. Well, if you have so much overlap in it that a lot of this pressure wants to go through the engine during overlap and drawing air and fuel, because it draws air and fuel, we'll go back to your O2 meters again, and you've got air blowing through the engine. It's not being combusted. How does that show up on the O2 meter? Well, it show up rich. Well, the combustion didn't change, but the free flow airflow did during overlap, because the hood scoop opening is so great. So that's just one of the reasons why, if you get to the very end of the track and all of a sudden, this is one of the reasons. There's a multitude of reasons. And all of a sudden it just goes flat rich. Well, you've got to look at, if you had a fuel turbine on it, if the increased airflow is just going through the engine during overlap. You got to remember, both valves are opened at one time. And when you're designing the camshaft, you haven't taken into effect that you're going to have 3, 4, or 5 pounds of pressure in the hood scoop, which is pretty significant for having air go through the engine. Next thing is, so if you control the opening, we'll go back here, so you only minimize the opening. Like in Pro Stock Motorcycle, they found this out, that the earlier, my friend Skip knows all these body things, but the openings were bigger, like on Arana's bikes, would actually slow it down, so all the newer ones are smaller and closer. Well, that's because they found out at some point you're just developing a parachute in front of the hood scoop. So the volume needs to be enough so that below 130 you're not struggling to get air into the venturis and the carburetors, in 360 degrees. So the volume is important, but the opening doesn't want to be any bigger than it needs to fill itself. Because at that point, you're creating aerodynamic drag by having a bigger and bigger. So if you look at the position of these things, you'll see that the science of hood scoops can get pretty involved. You need volume, but you don't need any more opening. Then if you look at how the top fuel cars have moved the hood scoop to the front of the supercharger, well, it didn't need to do that for any other reason than the fact that it needs to have the air going down through the charger, based on the fact that these things are doing huge miles an hour. So it's filling in, and now it's emptying it into the beginning. We can't do that naturally aspirated, because at the lower engine speeds, we're not creating boost, in the plenum like they are mechanically through the supercharger, creating boost. So our combination of hood scoop, we need volume, and then we need to measure the opening for the fill rate to the plenum. So there's a lot going on in the hood scoop to get it right. one that I liked, I don't know if it's made anymore, but I really liked the one that Spitzer made years ago. It had a plenum, then a snorkel out in front. It looked weird. I forget what they called it, but I really did like that hood scoop. It did all things right. You know, the aerodynamic drag, the opening was in front of the plenum, so you didn't create more frontal area on the hood scoop to create more drag. So, I didn't design it, but I really liked it. So once again, we're going to go back and we're going to look at, what creates high gear O2 combustion problems. And now we're going to go down and we're going to speak about what comes up from the bottom. We're looking at intake valve closing timing when the camshafts are developed, and developed on a dyno, and you're usually dynoing from peak torque to peak horsepower. So you're optimizing the valve timing to reach in there. On drag engines, the engines usually run above peak horsepower. If the intake valve closes right at peak horsepower, what you end up getting is a reversion coming back up from the bottom. When the airspeed goes up, and then the valve closes, well, by the nature of that, it has to repulse back up, and we call it reversion. And somebody asked about the shear plates. Well, the reason why the shear plates come down a little bit is to try to minimize the effect of the pulse coming back up from the intake runner and disturbing what's under the carbs. But if you optimize your plenum size and your valve timing only for the range between peak torque and peak horsepower, well, then once again, this is another thing. This is why it's, it takes experience to figure out which of these things are causing the thing to go, by the O2 meter rich or to be lean, is if it's sending a signal back up through the carburetor and air passing the booster 2 times, once coming in normally and once going back out. This is by the nature of the cam closing the valve closing the intake velocity and sending it back up. So that'll make everything look richer once again when you're at the end of the track. So a lot of times what I'm doing at the end of the track is I'm looking to see, do all 8 cylinders in this case go rich at once? Okay, well, if they all go rich at once, it's more likely to be the intake valve closing, especially when it's over peak, than it would be the hood scoop. If I see it where the back cylinders are looking a little different than the front cylinders, then I might say, well, okay, the hood scoop looks like it's got a bigger influence. Plus, I get a chance, I look at the hood scoops and see if they're small plenum hood scoops with large openings or bigger plenum hood scoops with smaller openings. So I get a chance to look at that. Do I always comment on it all? No. Why? Because it gets so involved, the customer would just get lost. You're looking at cylinder distribution. So usually when I'm in the bottom of high gear, some vehicles might be over 130 miles an hour at that point. A-Ultra certainly might be, Pro Stock certainly might be. So I might look a little further back to see how the combination between plenum volume, in Pro Stock, because a lot of them use the same hood scoop for a lot of vehicles, I could be very familiar. One time when I was working with Larry Morgan, Larry put a bigger hood scoop on it, and I could tell, because in Pro Stock we couldn't run, at that time, we ran modified Hollies, and it basically shut down the booster. The hood scoop pressure went up. With the booster above the Venturi, the Venturi became the restriction, and it actually decreased the fuel delivery. So that's one of the reasons why we put the Venturi above it, because no matter how much hood scoop pressure you put in, it won't change how linear the air-fuel ratio is. The delivered air-fuel ratio between the booster and the air itself. It's very linear. We call it a fuel line, not a fuel curve. And so people say, oh man, when you look at, like we have one guy that came over the United States from Sweden, and he said, oh, the lines are so straight, so I expanded the lines. I changed the graph value from, Racepack uses 20 for the high number down to 15, so you could get some separation, but they were just so even in order to get separation. Once we separate, then it looks like it's bigger because the graph changed. but they can be very flat based on the sciences that we use. So if you want to get them further apart so you can be more distinguishing, you have to change the graph value, going from 20 to 15, and that'll give you make the lines look a lot higher and lower. But when you're looking at trying to get these things more and more even and picking through how many things could be causing it to go rich, such as the intake valve closing, size of plenum, hood scoop volume, hood scoop opening, position of the booster, and all of these influences on what's the residual in and or near your O2. The other thing is the position O2. So going through all of these things, and I just love it when somebody says, "Oh, this thing's running rich or lean," and starts, what makes you think so? It's got to be carburetor related. Chances are, if it's something that we're delivering at this point, with our airfoil boosters and stuff, it's extremely likely it's not the carburetor, because the carburetors are very linear through their entire range. It's maybe something affecting the carburetor, something above it or below it, or how the fuel distribution is, the speed of the vehicle, size of the plenum, size of the opening. Then you got the thermodynamic balance. If all of this is perfect and the rear cylinder happens to be getting, because the water's coming in and out of the front of the engine, you haven't got the water isolated or a really thick deck block, and you can have a lot going on where the influence to the, like I say, even the position where the sensor is can have an influence at time, how much air is running over the tube to what the meter says. So it takes a lot of experience to pick through all of that and know, looking at certain spots in the run when you're going down the track, when I know it would be neutral, one of these things, you have no influences on it, I would know it would be neutral. You wouldn't have an influence at that point of the hood scoop opening because you're not going fast enough. So you're looking at the vacuum of the engine drawing on the opening, not the pressure in the opening. So then you're looking at the volume in the hood scoop and how it's drawing, around the carburetor, because at that point, when you don't have any pressure, each venturi is looking to draw at 360 degrees around each venturi. Do you have the volume around the carburetor opening so that each one is drawing smoothly? So then as you go up and you got airspeed, how much airspeed you're putting in it, just speed. Then how much pressure based on the opening. So it gets further and further down. Then when you get down the back, then sorting that out between valve closing. If it's a fairly short RPMs and it doesn't run well over peak. Some engine builders know how to manage this over peak. Those run better. They don't. If you can see them, especially in first gear when the RPM rate of acceleration is so fast, you can just see the G meter fall right off. So it's very, very clear that the intake valve is closing. I mean, they really will lose power. And if you dyno them, they can really lose power if they don't run over peak. The optic is to try to make it lose as little power as possible over peak. You don't want to lose like a ton of power, just a tiny bit over peak, because you're probably going to shift it over peak. You're going to run through the traps over peak. You don't want the car accelerating, then all of a sudden you can actually feel it slowing down because it doesn't run well over peak. So there's a lot of little individual things to have to draw from here in order to answer when I'm looking at it. So a lot of times I'll say, the hood scoop pressure down the other end, knowing darn well that you can also have some reversion problems with the intake valves closing the intake charge. When you're looking at the best combination between port area, airspeed, and closing, that's how you work on your engine performance. If you have a circle track car, you'll tend to work down closer to this range. If you have a drag car, you're going to be working from, just under peak horsepower to over peak horsepower. The only time you'll look at, these lower numbers is, coming into the clutch. And you won't come in the clutch below those. You'll come in the clutch around these numbers in the gear change. So there is a infinite number of influence is on the O2's. So I've given more information and maybe not enough in some areas. So add some specific questions and I'll try to relate to this. I'm not going to throw this away, and I can add them over the next few days during, right now it's near Christmas time and New Year's. I hope this all worked out, and have a great day. Bye.